Sally Russelll is over as part of our Greening Organisations and Work Leeds University Network. So we're a collection of universities and organisations that have an interest in workplace environmental sustainability, particularly in terms of looking at individual employees' behaviour and how we can use different techniques, whether it's architectural, organisational, psychological, and so on, to help change behaviour, to help increase workplace environmental performance. So a few of our partners, and just a little bit more of a plug. So we have this vision, which is quite grand, but we're hoping to make small steps. So creating knowledge, practical insights into how we can help support organisations in changing behaviours and improving environmental performance. So we've done a number of activities today, so in terms of getting people from various universities together, working with industry forums, trying to identify key challenges, research-open exchanges, academic presentations, but also trying to set up some new applied projects as well. So we're keen with trying to work with new organisations and provide input where we can do there, looking to design new environmental initiatives. We'll help to evaluate those as well. So, without further ado, I have great pleasure in presenting Sally Russelll. She's going to talk tonight about key drivers of pro-environmental behaviours in the workplace. It's probably about 45 minutes to an hour with some direct questions after, and we can have about a half hour of discussion at the end, which can be a little bit more general in terms of how we may use certain behavioural techniques if people try and draw on people's experiences, how we use some of Sally's knowledge and other things we know that work well to share with the group. So I think that's it. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Matt. And thank you very much for coming tonight and choosing to be here. I do appreciate your time, and I hope you find what I have to say valuable, and I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. And thanks to Chris and Matt and the Centre here for hosting me at Leeds for a month. It's great to be here. I do wish the weather was a little better, but I won't mention it again, I promise. As Matt said, I'm from Griffith University in Brisbane, in Australia. And before I start, I wanted to tell you about the background of my slides. I use these slides and this imagery by Chris Jordan, who's an artist in the States, and he uses found objects and garbage and stuff like this, which is plastic beverage bottles. So 2 million plastic beverage bottles make up this image, which is the number used in the US every 5 minutes. And I'm really interested in how environmental issues are communicated, and I think Chris Jordan does a really good job of bringing the significance of environmental issues into an image that we can kind of relate to. So you can actually scroll into this image and you'll see on the next slide on the left-hand side, you can see exactly what the images are made up of. So tonight what I wanted to go through, first of all, I'll just give you a quick snapshot of two major projects that I'm involved in. And then I want to talk in more general terms about pro-environmental behaviour. So a bit of a background of why I am researching particularly environmental issues at an individual level within organisations. And then what do we know about that individual level from looking at both organisational behaviour research as well as organisational change, and then bringing in environmental psychology research as well. So based on those three streams of literature. And then I want to kind of give you a snapshot of some of the research projects that I've been involved in and the results that are coming out of those. And particularly my research is focused on the role of emotion and how emotion affects the decisions and the behaviours that we engage in. So an emotional reaction to an environmental issue then affects our subsequent behaviour and decision making. I'll then talk a little bit about behavioural interventions and a behavioural intervention study that I've conducted with an organisation in Australia, and then some summary and final thoughts before we move on to some questions. So the two major projects that I'm involved in at the moment, the first is the Urban Water Security Research Alliance, which is an alliance of 3 universities, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, in Australia, as well as the Queensland Government. And the aim there is really to look at water in general in southeast Queensland. When I first became involved in this project, we were in the worst drought that we'd seen in 100 years. At about the middle of the interventions where we were trying to get people to reduce water, we actually had the worst drought that we'd had, the worst flood that we'd had in 100 years. So we went from one extreme to another, and now it seems to be settling down. but we'll see what happens. So in that project, I'm really involved in water demand management in southeast Queensland and dealing with these weather extremes, particularly looking at the psychosocial drivers of water demand. And we've run some intervention studies around that as well. The second project, which is a more recent project, is part of the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility in Australia. So it's funded by NCAF. I'm involved in a lot of research projects that have really long names and really bad acronyms, so I apologise for that. This is a collaborative project, particularly with one organisation that I'm working with in Brisbane, and I'm leading a stream of research where we're looking at emotions as a driver of behaviour. So what emotions do people experience, and then how does that affect their behaviour both within and outside the workplace? So just to give you a bit of a background of the research that I'm involved in and the work that I do, it's really focused on this individual level. But when we look at the literature in environmental studies and organisations, it tends to be focused on macro level issues. So looking at organisational strategy, looking at markets, regulation, reporting, and competitive forces. So it's very macro level, looking at how organisations behave at that level and at an industrial level. Much less research is focused on the individual and looking at what drives individuals and how they engage in behaviour and decision making. But when we look at it, individuals have a really significant and important role to play. Really, when we look at organisations, the decisions across all levels of the organisation are going to impact on the behaviour of that organisation. But little work has really been going into this. So individuals play a really important role in both initiating and creating change as well as sustaining it, and also in terms of leading change within organisations. Throughout the presentation, I'll talk about this concept of workplace pro-environmental behaviour. And what I mean by that is really quite a broad term in that it's anything that an employee engages in that can improve the environmental performance of the company. So it could be something to set up an environmental strategy through to switching off lights or switching off computers. So a really broad range of behaviours. So looking at what we know to date about pro-environmental behaviour, we draw a lot on environmental psychology research. And there's kind of two key theories that are used very frequently. The first one, the theory of planned behaviour, looking at attitudes, so positive or negative evaluation, subjective norms, so whether I think other important people think that this is a good thing that I should be doing. Perceived behavioural control, so the extent to which I think I have control over this action, and then intention to behave, so do I intend to engage in this behaviour, and they come together to predict what someone might do. The value belief norm theory is another theory that is particularly relevant to pro-environmental behaviours. So Stern's work there suggests that people's values, their beliefs about environmental issues, as well as their personal norms or their kind of personal obligation that they feel to act, these things again come together to predict what someone might do. So looking at that in a little bit more detail, this comes from some work I've done with a colleague, Kelly Fielding, in the water space. So this is looking at predicting, using the theory of planned behaviour as the model, predicting installing a water efficient device. So an attitude is the evaluation of whether that's a good or a bad thing. Subjective norm, so the extent to which I feel or think that other important people, so it might be the community or it might be my family members, think that that's a good thing to do. And perceived behavioural control. So these are both real or perceived control issues. So do I have enough money to be able to purchase this appliance, or is this something that I feel that I can do? So it's both perceived and actual. The intention, so whether or not I intend to do it, and then the actual behaviour. One of the key limitations with both this and the next model that I'll show you is the gap between intention and behaviour. So even though we can predict what people intend to do, often that doesn't lead to behaviour. So the behavioural intention gap is a significant issue that we struggle with in this sort of research. And that's something that I kind of try and overcome by measuring actual behaviour, but I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a minute. I won't go into this model in too much detail, but as you can see here, the values on the left-hand side, so three different types of values. So biospheric, so kind of concern for the natural environment, altruistic, concern for people and society, and egoistic, concern for the self. Beliefs, three different types of beliefs. Those personal pro-environmental norms, so the personal obligation, and these things lead to different types of behaviours. So Stern suggests that each one is additive. So my values are going to affect my beliefs and my personal norms as well as my behaviour. So each one affects the one further along the line. Now, while these models have been really successful in predicting behaviour, they assume a very rational way of thinking. So a rational way of making decisions and acting. And this really neglects some of the key elements when we look at why people engage in pro-environmental behaviour. The first thing is habits. So habits are really those automatic things that we do. We don't have to think about doing them. So it's behaviour that's guided by an automatic process. So habit is formed, it's reinforced, and then it's maintained. So often, lots of the pro-environmental behaviours that we look at are enforced by habits. And so it's really important that we consider this when we're looking at trying to change or understand why people engage in pro-environmental behaviours. So when we're talking about habits, we often think about it in terms of the frequency of behaviour, but that's not really the key element. When we talk about habits, it's really about the way that the decision is made. So it's this automaticity that's important when we think about habits. Now, the second key element is emotion, and this is really where my research is based around. So looking at affect and emotion, when I talk about emotion, it's a feeling that arises in response to an event or a significant issue. And it has this object specificity, so something causes the emotional reaction. And it's also, we can think of it in two different elements. So the first one is valence, so whether the emotion is positive or negative. And the second dimension is arousal, so whether an emotion is strong or weak. So emotion has been shown to be a key driver of behaviour. And when we look at the psychology literature, one of the things, in environmental psychology literature, one of the things that's suggested is in order to get people to do something, so we want people to, consider walking or catching the bus or doing something different rather than driving to work. So all we need to do is raise their emotions, and that's going to encourage them to do something differently. That tends to be what the psychology literature suggests. But my research and the research of some of my colleagues is suggesting, well, actually, that's not it. We need to pay more attention to both the valence and the arousal of the emotion. Because when we get into it, it's really those sorts of things. Different emotions are going to lead to different sorts of behaviours. If we think about climate change, as an example, a lot of the media attention and a lot of the communication around climate change is about fear. And while that can be successful in raising attention, it's not necessarily successful in changing behaviour. A fear response can lead to withdrawal, and different emotions have different behavioural tendencies. So this is really what I tried to unpack in my research. So I want to go through three key studies that came out of my PhD work and that are continuing. So the first one, and they were really trying to tap into this idea of emotion and environmental issues and the effect on behaviour. So the first thing I did was a qualitative interview study. So interviewing managers and senior executives and talking to them about environmental issues and sustainability. So I really wanted to look at what are the environmental issues that they're talking about, what are the pro-environmental behaviours that they discuss, and then what emotions are they expressing when they talk about these things. So 31 interviews, undertook a thematic and content analysis, and what I found was that, yes, people do use emotion when they talk about environmental issues. And even though we might kind of suggest that organisations are rational places and emotion doesn't belong there, more and more we're starting to see and recognise that we can't take the emotion out of business. And in fact, if we look at research in cognitive psychology, we can't actually make a rational decision without the emotion centre of our brain. So emotions really play a hugely important role in all of the decisions that we make. So environmental issues did provoke emotional reactions in these managers that I interviewed. And what I also found was when the managers were talking about issues that were personal or at the individual level, something close to them, it was a stronger emotional reaction and they used more emotional words than when they were talking about the organisation. So if something is more close and more personal, it's more likely to lead to a stronger emotional reaction. The second study was a survey study. And so the aim here was to kind of try and test some of these models that I was talking about earlier, but also bring in this emotion content. So I ran a survey, 324 employees over 5 different organisations from a range of different industries. So there's finance and utilities, stationery supply, and the other two I can't think of at the top of my head. So range of different industries. What I found was that positive emotions actually enhanced pro-environmental behaviour. So if people were feeling better, they were more likely to engage in this behaviour. Different to what I expected given the previous research in this area, negative emotions actually impeded pro-environmental behaviour. So if people were feeling strong negative emotions, they did less. Corporate environmental values, so looking at the corporate climate or the culture of the organisation, if that was supportive of environmental issues, then that also enhanced pro-environmental behaviour. So this really suggests that the corporate culture around the environment has a significant effect on what people do. So people look to the organisation for signals about what's appropriate. Personal environmental values were also positively related, as you would expect. But what was interesting is those corporate environmental values, or that corporate culture, was as important as those personal values. So it really plays a strong role in signalling what an employee should do. The final study that I wanted to talk about in this section was an experimental study, and actually made up of three different studies, or three different repetitions. So what I did and what I wanted to do was test the direct effect. So if I kind of manipulated people and got them to experience a certain emotion, what did they do in response? And I actually wanted to test the result on their actual behaviour. So I manipulated 5 different discrete emotions, or 5 specific emotions. So anger, fear, which are high arousal, negative emotions; sadness, which is a low arousal, negative emotion; confidence or contentment, which is a low arousal, positive emotion; and hope or joy, which is a high arousal, positive emotion. So testing around those different dimensions, and I created videos in order to arouse these different emotions. So videos about how the climate change would affect Australian businesses. So I'm going to show you a clip so you get an idea of what they look like. So in the studies, the participants were presented with a video to arouse their emotion in relation to this issue. They were then given a survey, which is a bit of a filler task, and then I asked them to do something. And this was kind of a crude measure of behaviour. For the students, what I did, it was in kind of a lab setting. I gave them a piece of paper at the start of the experiment and asked them to make up a unique code. When they left the experiment, they had to throw that piece of paper away, and they had an opportunity to recycle or not recycle. And I wasn't sure if this would work, because I thought, surely most people would recycle, right? But no, it did actually work. And I'll tell you what the findings were in a minute. The online study actually ran it with employees as well, through an online survey, where they were presented again with a video survey. And then I asked them if they'd like to receive more information about how they could engage in workplace pro-environmental behaviour in their organisation. And they had an opportunity to say yes or no and download that information. So pretty crude measures of behaviour, but what I was trying to do is get some sort of measure of behaviour rather than just self-reporting. So don't get too depressed just yet, but I want to give you an idea of what the videos look like.
The latest report by the Governmental BCC has again demonstrated the importance of environmental issues. Compiled by 2,500 scientists, the report warns that immediate, significant and sustained action is necessary if we are to avoid the catastrophic and potentially irreversible effects of global warming. In light of the IPCC report, we look at the impact these findings will have for Australian businesses. The report makes clear that businesses are not immune from the impacts of environmental issues. Indeed, recent research by KPMG suggests that managers are under increasing pressure to respond to issues such as climate change and limited resources. Earlier today, we spoke with two experts to hear their opinion on how business can most effectively respond to these environmental issues. One of those experts was Associate Professor Andrew Griffiths from the University of Queensland, who was a leading researcher of climate change and corporate sustainability. He had this to say.
Corporations have contributed to many of the environmental problems we are facing, and they really are playing a big part in the solution. It's really disheartening to think of the effect our environmental problems will have on our future generations. Although it was important, I can't say a whole bunch hope of seeing an effective resolution.
So you can start to see there the facial expressions, the voice tone. The actors were trained to display those expressions. Also the imagery in the background. I used imagery that was tested previously to evoke certain emotions. So the garbage bin rolls and the smokestacks have been shown to create a negative emotional reaction. Just some clips. So the fear response. You can see the tightening of the neck and the wider eyes. The same imagery in the background. Anger. Again, similar imagery, but much tighter neck, and she was really good at anger. And so each one had the voice tone and facial expressions according to the emotion that was being expressed. The positive emotion conditions. So in the background we've got blue skies with white clouds and solar panels and wind farms. And I'll show you a positive clip in a second, just to leave you on a happier note than that one. And again, the facial expressions and voice tone are quite different.
The latest report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has again demonstrated the importance of environmental issues. Compiled by 2,500 scientists,
this wasn't the most over-the-top version.
Significant and sustained action in order to address current environmental issues. The report makes clear that even the most stringent changes are affordable using currently available technologies. In light of the IPCC report, we look at the impact these findings will have for Australian businesses. The report makes clear that businesses are not immune from the impacts of environmental issues. Indeed, recent research by KPMG suggests that managers are under increasing pressure to respond to issues such as climate change and limited resources. Earlier today, we spoke with two experts to hear their opinion on how business can most effectively respond to these environmental issues. One of those experts was Associate Professor Andrew Griffiths from the University of Queensland, who is a leading researcher of climate change and corporate sustainability. He had this to say.
So many organisations are already coming up with creative solutions to our environmental problems. It's exciting to see so much innovation going on. I maintain hope that business will continue to transform sustainable practices. We'll see an
effective resolution in the future. Okay, so you can see kind of the two extremes there, and what I was trying to do was, once people experience those emotions, what did they actually do? What I found, and what was consistent across the three different studies, was that sadness had a strong negative effect on the recycling or information-seeking behaviour. So people in that condition, there were also two control conditions. So one was a written control condition where people read a written transcript without any of the emotion language included. The other control condition was an audio-visual stimulus, similar to the ones we saw, but without the imagery in the background and with a very neutral tone and expression. So compared to the control conditions, the sadness had a very strong negative effect. So people pretty much didn't recycle in that condition at all, and none of them, or very few of them, selected to receive information. The other emotion conditions also had an effect, but it wasn't one that was consistent across the three studies, whereas the sadness effect was significant across all of those studies. The other finding was that the effect of emotion was attenuated in the field. So when I ran the experiment with the office employees, the effect size of the emotion was reduced. And this could be either because of the online condition or because of, as I mentioned earlier, this signal from the management or from the organisational culture. So if people are looking to the organisation for those signals, then we would expect the effect of personal emotion to be attenuated. So in terms of the summary of key findings from across the studies, so the importance of organisational culture and context. So looking at the organisational culture, it does play a really strong role in providing a signal for employees. So this really suggests that top management support and that top management visual support is really essential for pro-environmental behaviour. And also there's a clear environmental policy, so making sure it's communicated well and that people within the organisation know about it. In looking at the role of emotion as a driver of behaviour, it's clear that negative emotion can definitely impede behaviour. Much less so from my research, but from my colleagues' research, it does suggest that positive emotion actually does enhance pro-environmental behaviour, particularly for those employees that have low pro-environmental attitudes. So for people who are already pro-environmental, their positive emotions aren't really going to affect them, but for people who don't have those attitudes, if they are aroused into a positive state, then they're more likely to engage. So we really need to look at this idea of using emotion as kind of an intervention, particularly if previous designs have suggested we just need to raise emotion. We need to pay attention to what emotions are being evoked through these sorts of messages. And there's also inherent in this the idea that self-efficacy is important. So if we look at the emotion of sadness or hopelessness, it's also indicative of a lack of efficacy, so a lack of the idea that what I do is going to have an impact. So in order to create change, we also need to pay attention to self-efficacy. So at this point, I wanted to, rather than looking at what drives behaviour, move on to talking about how we might change it and what we know about intervention design. So to do that, I want to talk about two different types of interventions. So we can kind of categorise them according to the type of intervention. If it's an antecedent intervention, doing something before the behaviour occurs. So information or knowledge, trying to increase knowledge, or setting specific targets are examples of antecedent interventions. Consequence interventions occur after the behaviour has occurred. So making the consequences of that behaviour salient and relevant to the individual. So for example, providing feedback about savings that have been made is an example of a consequence intervention. One of the key issues in any intervention design, and when we're looking at change management in general in organisations as well, one of the key issues is about measurement. And particularly, as I mentioned before, in pro-environmental behaviour, if we're trying to change behaviour, then we need to measure the actual behaviour rather than relying on proxies of that behaviour. So in measuring behaviour, we need to pay attention to what the target behaviour is. Often when we're measuring, if we're trying to change lighting, people switching off lights, for example, if we're just measuring broadly pro-environmental behaviour in general, that's not going to give us a good indicator of the target behaviour that we're actually trying to change. And we also need to measure at the level of the intervention. One of the key issues that I face and that organisations face is that measurement at the level of intervention. So I'll talk about an intervention in a second that I conducted with the Mater Hospital in Brisbane in Australia, and in trying to change their energy behaviour, they measure at the level of the building. But they've got, they were just trying to change behaviour of the administrative block, so they couldn't actually measure the change at that level because of the way that the building was measured. So measuring at the level of the behaviour change intervention is hugely important in order to evaluate the effectiveness of that intervention. The other key issue that I've mentioned previously is this idea of self-reported behaviour versus measuring observed behaviour. So if at all possible, we really want to get to the point where we're measuring observed behaviour because that's really the thing that we're trying to change. There's also different types of behaviour, and the research suggests that different types of behaviour are going to be driven by different things, as well as they may require different types of interventions. So the example that I gave when I was talking about the theory of planned behaviour with the installing the water efficient shower head, that's an example of an efficiency behaviour. So it's something that you do once off, and then once it's installed, you don't need to think about it again. So installing more efficient appliances is an example of that. Curtailment behaviours are more the ones that are driven by habit, and these are the sorts of things that we engage in on a day-to-day basis. So something that we have to think about or make a decision about continuously. There's also a difference between public and private sphere behaviours. So the VBN theory, or the value belief norm theory that I mentioned before, particularly draws this distinction. So the public sphere behaviours are things that have an indirect impact. So it might be activism or lobbying, but they're at that higher level and in the public domain. Whereas private sphere behaviours are those things that have a direct impact. So our direct behaviours, so energy reduction, waste disposal, recycling, water management, all of those things that have the direct effect. So just going through some of the information that we know about antecedent and consequence interventions. So when we're talking about antecedent interventions, one of the main ways and most common ways that interventions are designed are around information. So if we give people information then about climate change or whatever it is, then they'll do something about it. But what we find is that while this might be effective in raising people's knowledge about an issue, it doesn't actually change their behaviour. Kind of the exception to providing information is providing normative information. So Cialdini is a researcher who's done a lot of work in this particular area, and providing descriptive normative information particularly, has been demonstrated to be really effective. And one of his most famous studies that most people can relate to is based in a hotel setting. And so you know those little signs that you get that say, please reuse your towels, care for the environment, whatever it might be. Well, he tested using different information on those particular signs. And what he found was that the most effective way of providing that information was using a descriptive norm. So the majority of guests in this room have reused their towels. And this is something that we've trialled in water demand management and found it to be really effective. So providing information about what others in the local area do, or other households like yours, that is really effective in changing people's behaviour. An environmental norm would be help save the environment by reusing your towels, but it is much less effective. And this sort of study has been tested in multiple settings and found, and it has been found that descriptive norm information is really effective. What's also interesting is recent research has suggested and shown that people don't think that that sort of information affects them. So when they were asked after the fact what actually changed their behaviour or what they paid attention to that made them do something differently, descriptive norms were rated very low on that ranking. So even though people don't think it is having an effect, it really does have an effect on their behaviour. In looking at consequence interventions, feedback is a really an effective as well as a popular approach to providing a consequence intervention. And an example would be an energy monitor. The effectiveness of this type of intervention is really dependent on the frequency of the feedback. So if it's continuous and kind of in the moment, then that can be much more effective. But again, the measurement needs to be at the level of the behaviour that you're attempting to change. And also individual group versus group feedback. So Crucio and Rima found that group feedback within an organisation was really effective in encouraging energy use. And other studies have also shown comparative feedback to be an effective mechanism to create change and to create long-term sustained change. I just wanted to give you a short example of a study antecedent intervention that I've been involved in with working with the Martin Hospital in Brisbane. So what we are doing in working with them, it has its challenges trying to bring the research and practical applications and outcomes together. But what they wanted to do was try and engage their employees in energy saving. So we needed to come up with a cheap, effective intervention for them. And what we did was looked at an antecedent intervention using prompts and top management support. So drawing on this research about providing this context and providing this imagery. What we did was that it was a pre-test, post-test design. So we ran some visual inspection audits. So as I mentioned before, we couldn't measure the behaviour at the level using the infrastructure that they had. So we did visual inspection audits where we went around the hospital and only in their administrative areas. We didn't want people switching off switches in hospitals that they shouldn't. So we went around the administrative areas and evaluated. It was computers, monitors, lighting, printers. I think that was it. PowerPoints for charges and that sort of thing. So we evaluated how many of those were left on overnight, and we did that before the intervention and after, and then 6 months following as well. We also ran a self-reported survey, and interestingly in this study we actually found the self-report matched with the audited results, which was good for us. So it was a pre-test, post-test with both auditing, observed behaviour, as well as self-reported behaviour. So what we found was that initially lighting pretty much stayed the same. So there was an initial improvement of 3%, which wasn't significant. But with lighting, we found that it actually increased. So less lights were switched on 6 months following the intervention, which was a little surprising, a little disappointing. In looking at computers, we initially saw a significant improvement, 21%, and though this bounced back a little bit at the 6 month follow-up, it was still significant from time 1 to time 3. So, and also with monitors, we saw an initial improvement, and again, this was maintained at the 6 month follow-up. So one of the things to come out of this study was what we found was those behaviours that people were controlling individually, so the computers and their monitors, all of those things had an immediate effect, and then that effect was maintained, although to a reduced extent, 6 months after the intervention. What was interesting with the lighting is it's a collective behaviour. So there's a lot of open plan offices, and it's not one person's responsibility. So we didn't find an effect based on this intervention around lighting. So one of the things that we're hoping to do is start to investigate, well, what sort of interventions might be effective for not only individual level decision making, but decision making that has this collective responsibility. So there's a dilution of responsibility around lighting and other sorts of appliances that are shared. So just to summarise and I guess leave you with some final thoughts. So the first thing I guess to emphasise is that individuals really do have an important role to play. So behaviour is an irrational process. We do use emotions in all of the decisions that we make. So it's important that we pay attention to that if we're trying to understand behaviour. The organisational context is also essential. So if we're looking at changing behaviour within organisations, we need to look at what the top management support and the organisational culture is doing. And finally, in looking at interventions and targeting behavioural interventions, we need to look at what those target behaviours are, make sure we're measuring at the appropriate level, and make sure also that we're measuring actual behaviour, not some sort of proxy of intention or self-reported behaviour. So we need to make sure we're evaluating that really effectively. And as a final thought, I'll leave you with one of my favourite quotes by Eckhart Tolle. So the change in the collective does not happen until the change happens in the individual. The individuals make up the collective. This is why we're here. We're looking at the collective insanity and seeing how it works. And that is the first step to liberation. Thank you.
So can I thank Sally for really entertaining the talk. That was a very good overview in general of the psychology literature there as well. If anybody's got any specific questions to with Sally just covered, should we take those first and then we have a little bit more of a broader discussion? So is there anything which is a burning question? Will?
On the towel thing,
Yeah.
it didn't work in I can see how it works in where you've got a transition coming through.
Yeah.
They don't actually know if everybody else is doing it or not.
Yeah.
But in the workplace setting, you need to find out pretty quick that actually the other is doing it.
Yeah, I think there's one.
Distrust on the institution, and then they wouldn't trust anything.
Yeah, it has to be real. So in the example, the water demand management study that we did with households, we took a survey and looked at water use within that local community. And then we segregated people according to the types of households. So households with young families like yours, 80% of them save water by doing this. So we were reporting real stats. And it's important, yeah, in the message that it is true to life. But I think there is a recent example of a workplace, I think it might have even been a university, where they had signs up of the percentage of people that turn off lights in a bathroom. And it was a really interesting design because they put up the posters, it was like an A-B design, so they put up the posters, tested the effect, removed them, tested again, put them back up, and they found it had a significant effect. But I think they were again using descriptive norms. But yeah, I don't know in offices where everyone knows each other how it would work. I haven't seen it used in that context.
I see about the telephone.
Yeah.
When the signs up, it could be that the management pretending to be environmental, but really they want to save money. So people might see things that and not respond to that.
Yeah, for sure. So it's definitely an issue, and actually we had a PhD workshop earlier today where we were talking about exactly this issue. And with the hospital actually that I work with, that's one of the things that, so some people are doing it because, or in the management interviews that I've done, some people see the key driver is cost, whereas others are seeing it much more as the ethos of care, and that's why they should be engaging in sustainability. But the extent to which that's important, or the extent to which cynicism will come in and people will not do it because they think it's just for cost, I'm not sure how that actually affects behaviour.
Because obviously on cost,
Yeah.
if you're seeking to change behaviour for a business, quite often the low-hanging fruit is going to be financial saving.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
that's going to help get business leaders on board. So
Yeah, well, one of the key things, and an area that I'm particularly interested in, is about framing. So, an issue selling. So it depends on who you're selling the issue to. So if you're a financial controller, then I'm going to sell the business imperative and the return on investment. But if you're one of the nuns on the board, then I'm going to sell compassion and care and commitment. So
for business, I mean, if it's environmental, that's great. But if it's also saving money, well, we're going to do it to save money.
but it also, I think it also depends on the return on investment and the length of time. Some organisations will take a much longer perspective, which for me is quite frustrating because it's going to save them money in the long term and they're not going to do it anyway because it's a huge, well, too big a cost up front. So it's definitely an issue, but to be honest, I don't know how to resolve it other than paying attention to the context that you're in and trying to pitch it in such a way that you're selling it in the right way. So organisations that have a really strong environmental ethos, selling the environmental issue, imperative might be more successful than selling the business imperative.
Yeah. Okay.
I'd like to see more of those sorts of organisations.
So just a technical question.
Yeah.
Did you check that the emotions of individuals changed as a result of your
Yes, yeah, definitely. And again, this is one thing that we were talking about earlier around the method. But the manipulation checks is one thing that's kind of a glitch in the system because I had to run the manipulation checks separately. So running them not with the participants who are engaged in this action of behaviours. Because what I didn't want to do was show the videos, ask them how they felt, and then see how the behaviour influenced them, because that's going to bias the results, getting them to already pay attention to their emotions. So I ran it separately, but what I did was I got people to rate each video rather than getting them to do it individually. If that makes sense. So one person saw one video, then did a survey, saw another video, did a survey, saw another video, did a survey, and I saw 3 at a time. So what I now need to do is run them separately. So only one person seeing one video and testing that that emotion was aroused. There's also an issue around, is it the emotion that's in the message, or is it the emotion that the person is experiencing? So my aim was trying to get them to experience that emotion rather than just paying attention to the message. But yeah, the extent to which that was effective, the manipulation checks I've done show that, but I do need a stronger manipulation check to be able to get it through the publication process. But yeah, good point. Yeah. Fingers crossed again. Yeah.
It's just a question around the collective ritual.
Yeah.
I was just looking at the OCB literature, aggregated OCB,
Yeah.
predicting individual behaviors. Have you done any unit level analysis of environmental behaviors predicting individual behaviors?
No, I haven't actually. The closest that I've got is looking at, in the water studies that I've been doing, is looking at the household culture for water saving, and that does predict individual self-reported behaviour, but not within an organisational context. But so was it collective OCBs?
Yeah, unitized structures.
Yeah.
Bank branches.
Yeah.
Retail outlets. So when you look at the aggregate OCBs and those you predict individual.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It seems to me that the relationship between
Yeah, for sure. And there's actually some literature linking OCBs with one of our colleagues in the GROW network looks at environmental OCBs. So I definitely think there's a strong link between OCBs and pro-environmental behaviour. But if you've got a reference or two, yeah, that would be great.
Yes. Thank you. The first 2 models that you talked about both say that it's the linkage from attitudes towards behaviour. So
Yeah.
there are those who believe it's in part the other way. So
Yes.
it's the behaviours that you undertake that then create the attitudes. Yeah. So the two questions: do you buy that argument at all? And secondly, if so, where might emotion? So is there something about change the behaviours, create the attitudes, and perhaps change the behaviours, do that through rules,
Yeah.
and then see emotions as an outcome, or,
Yeah.
or in a loopy thing?
Yeah, exactly. So I think, yeah, I agree with you that these models definitely say that attitudes come first and then we have the behaviour. But if you're looking at cognitive dissonance theory or others, that if you engage in a behaviour, that can change your attitude. So I think it might work both ways. And also, I guess, I'm going to dodge a question here. Emotion is the same. So you can have an emotion, if you engage in a behaviour, that can lead you to experience an emotion. So the behaviour is the event that causes the emotion. So I do something good, I ride my bike to work so I feel pride. I don't ride my bike to work so I feel guilty. So I think, and then that affects your subsequent behaviours. So I think it very much is a feedback loop. But so far I've only really looked at emotion as an antecedent rather than emotion as a consequence.
Do you know of anybody, because I suspect that you'll be looking on this,
Yeah.
the people who go attitude behaviour and the others who go behaviour, they seem to have very strong, entrenched positions.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to be subject to competitive tests or process possible.
Yeah, I don't know how you would test it, but I think particularly within environmental psychology, the attitude behaviour camp, if you want to call it that, is the dominant one.
My sense is that kind of a social psychology.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the people in an organisation. I think a lot of people in organisational psychology, you say you want to change behaviour, you change the roles, you change the key performance indicators, you change the metrics, the behaviour may or may usually changes,
Yeah,
and then the attitudes and emotions perhaps will follow from that.
yeah.
So it's like a subdisciplinary category.
Yeah, so one of the key emotion theories is Wisdom Provenzato. Why have I lost it? It's gone. But they look at emotion arising from behaviours that people engage in, so uplifts and hassles, and that then leads to job attitudes. So they're exactly suggesting that. So, but much more organisationally based. But those emotions then lead to behaviours as well. So I guess it is a feedback loop that they're suggesting. Affective defence theory, there we go.
Can I ask about the methodology? You mentioned earlier about, I think it was the Queensland example, where the challenge with the actual metering of the building,
Yeah.
that it's difficult to be able to actually monitor at that level. But you also talked about the need to measure behaviour at the level how it's being exhibited.
Yeah,
How
exactly.
did you get around that? How did you actually do that?
So the only thing we were able to do was the visual inspection audits. So going around after hours and checking whether people had left things on or not.
As a group?
Individually, yeah. But we weren't able to link, so we could say the proportion in this area, the proportion of people who left computers on was X. But we couldn't say Joe Bloggs left his computer on. But there are software programs that will do that, but they're expensive and challenging to get a hold of and be able to use at that level. So yeah, the measurement is a huge issue when we're looking at inspection and design and measurement and evaluation. So
And there's also the issue around people are being singled out.
yeah,
But that is
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, you can't really, the ultimate, it would be able to, if you had some sort of metering that would measure that behaviour at a very individual level, be able to link it to their survey responses or the intervention that they received. But we couldn't do that in this case.
So Mark?
So yeah, thanks, very interesting talk. I just had a quick question about the context specificity of these sort of emotions you're around it.
Yeah.
With priming, they were all environmental examples.
Yeah, for
I was
sure.
wondering, would there be, I'm not really into those sort of emotions,
Yeah.
but would there be any effect if you just arouse those emotions perhaps with non-context specific examples? So I watched ET, for instance, to
Yeah.
understand or what have you. Or was it purely, does it have to be context driven?
Well, in this case, yeah, I was just testing the context. But the study by my colleague Kelly Fielding and her PhD students looked at the emotion that was non-context specific. So they found, this was the one where if people had low environmental attitudes and felt positive emotion, they were more likely to engage in pro-environmental behaviour. So there's an indicator there that it's non-context specific. But from my own research, I've only looked at the environmental context.
You talked about the importance of organisational context and values. How did you assess those, or were they taken as these respondents' views?
So in the survey, what I did was used Bobby Banerjee's measures. So he looks at things like the corporate environmental values, whether or not they've got a policy, how well kind of communicated it is, the level of top management support. So there's a whole kind of battery of items that he asked about around those particular issues, and it kind of covers all of kind of the key areas of organisational culture and policy and top management support.
And they tend to agree within an organisation?
What do you mean?
Say you had 3 people responding from one company, would they have similar responses? Or were the responses more related to their individual views on
Yeah, so what I was really measuring and what kind of goes into the model is perceptions of corporate environmental culture or values. So it would be a really good study similar to aggregating OCVs to be able to kind of, my ultimate aim in that survey study was to get 30 or more organisations and be able to aggregate at that level and do multi-level analysis. But because I didn't get enough organisations, I couldn't do that, so it ended up just being the perceptions of those individuals. But yeah, if you could aggregate at that level, you could come up with a corporate environmental climate measure for that particular organisation or group, and then be able to compare.
Sally, can I ask you a more general question?
You may.
So we were talking before about those techniques people would use.
Yeah.
And some of the issues about maintaining behaviour change over time. So when you were studying, she saw some bounce back.
Yeah, sure.
What's your impression in terms of what particular technique is likely to produce or seems to produce the best longer term maintenance of those behaviour changes? Or is it more nuanced? Is it a combination, or do you need to keep on that pressure weekend?
I think if I knew the answer to that question, I would be a rich woman. I think, yeah, to be honest, I don't know. So if the behaviour can become habitual and become normative within the organisation, and if the intervention can get it to that point, then I think that it will be really successful and maintained over the longer term. But to be honest, I don't know how, and I think it depends a lot on the organisation itself and the particular behaviour you're trying to change, as to how to get it to that level where it's just a new way of doing things.
So there's room for more work.
Pardon?
Room for more work.
Oh,
there.
for sure.
Can we maybe have a few more?
Can I just add to that? It seems to me that you'd always recommend that on your case study that people are responsible for their own things, like turning monitors or computers job. But on the SC University here,
Yeah.
and people trying to do technical solutions for that.
Yeah.
But they should abandon that because it's so difficult anyway, and just use the behaviour change of the individual and just concentrate on the communal things where the individual behaviour change will work. You might just concentrate on the energy of technical solution for that, and the behaviour change on what
The individual. Because
Because
one thing, just anecdotally, when you try and kind of manage technically something that's under an individual's control, it can lead to a bit of backlash. So I don't want you to turn my computer off at 5 p.m. because I want to stay till 7 or 8. Not that I would do that because I like one time at home. Yeah, so it's possible. But maybe could we do some research on it?